Hello and welcome everyone to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host Liam, aka Himvar, and today we have a video for you. We'll be discussing Elric of Melniboné, the buddy read for August. It's a little slow coming, but my guest and I were both on vacation holiday, well, the end of August and around early September as well. So, but as always, of course, I'm Liam, and I'll let my guest.
Hey, I'm Owen from Owen Edwards Book Reviews, which is another YouTube channel. And I think Liam and I both like classic fantasy and sci-fi, which has brought us together on this and on other books that we're interested in. Hence the video.
And so I think we had a few other people that joined at least for part of the book back in August. So I'm not sure if anyone else finished it for that matter.
I think maybe one or two people did. I know Narsil ended up deciding to read another 14,000 page book or something instead. But I think, which is, yeah, it was one, I think, the bottom of some lists that got added on and then bumped. But I think a couple of people finished it.
Yeah, and honestly, it's a really short book. So I have my copy right here.
Pause the video and go and read the book.
Yeah, pause the video. Yeah, really short. This is a copy that just has the book. I think your copy has a few other things in it. So
this is
tiny.
it's got that book because it is a short novel. It's the first novel in the cycle. It's a short novel, but then obviously because this is the Michael Moorcock collection, and I think they decided to bulk it out. Well, maybe that sounds cynical, but bulk it out by adding stuff like there's some early essays by him. There's a screenplay or graphic novel script, I think, of another Elric story. And there's a few introductions and stuff. Like there's one by Alan Moore. So I think it's about half that length in my copy.
Yeah, so I definitely didn't pay $1.25 for this. I wish I had, but that's okay. It's not 1972 anymore. I wasn't even close to born.
Mine is secondhand, but I don't know what it cost. It probably cost a few pounds, so $5 or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. And so let's see, where should we start? Do you just want to start with I mean, the book is divided into three parts, right? So maybe we could just start with like, just plot, pacing, stuff like that.
Yeah. What did you think?
So I'm just thinking that so of course it will contain spoilers. I don't know if I guess I hadn't already said that. That part one does a great job introducing.
Review, haven't we? Got
Yeah.
a non-spoiler review, haven't you, that people
Yes.
could watch?
Yeah, and I'll link that in the cards. And I mean, I'm trying to think actually. Let's see, because it's been over a month. That part one does a great job introducing the problem, so to speak, and the characters. And I'm trying to remember. Well, part two kind of like, I don't know, it kicks things up a notch, and then part three obviously is a resolution. It's probably the, I don't want to say this, like the biggest part as far as like happenings, like in such.
In some ways, not very much happens before book three, depending on how you measure that. But one thing is that it is just a really short book. So part one, for instance, is 44 pages in my edition. It's very short. So really, it's a chapter by some long book standards. Where you're reading 30 or 40 page chapters. It's literally a chapter by some author's standards.
True.
But yeah, I think that I thought there's upsides and downsides to, well, let's call it pacing and setup. Is the big upside is it doesn't overstay its welcome as a book. It is quick to get stuff done, stuff gets introduced, it gets finished, and you're never lagging behind. And I think, given how many tomes people read, I think a book that does that is surely to be valued, if nothing else, because if you hate it, it's going to be over soon.
That's true.
The flip side is, I kind of sometimes wanted or thought that, I don't know, maybe just there are a few things I thought, oh, that'd be interesting if there's a bit more time given to a character or a bit more time given to a place. And it's not really a book, I think it's fair to say, that is focused very much on geography or character on the whole, apart from Elric as a character.
Yeah, and it's not a book that has a map.
I'd say compare that to, there are plenty of fantasy authors where, like Scott Lynch, geography is very important. Like how important that is for why people like him. People will say, "Oh yeah, I just love the city. I loved Kamor," and no one's going to be like, "Melniboné was such a textured, wonderful, interesting place," are they? They're going to be like, "Yeah, I don't really remember." Some messed up stuff happens there. That's the
That's
so
about
yeah.
it.
I think the pacing means that he doesn't spend much time on stuff that is not really central to what he cares about, and I know that I probably wanted to know some more about some of the stuff, but I thought on the whole the pacing was a strength.
Yeah, and I think especially in part one, I think he does a fantastic job introducing like everything. It's basically like it's essentially a prologue for. I mean, maybe Elric in general. I'm only read one Elric book still, but I mean, it sets up the characters pretty well. I mean, that's mostly what it sets up. I mean, it sets up Elric's interests in Cymoril, his cousin, Yyrkoon's problems, and Elric's problems too, for that matter.
Because Elric is the emperor. He is a capable emperor. He has these two things. One, he's got a disability, a genetic disability, and two, he has a conscience. He is not like his cousin Yyrkoon in that sense is much more, and Chimeran as well, or Cymril, are much more traditional. They're much more like, yeah, we're Melnibonéans. We can do what we want. We should be ruthless. We should enjoy ourselves. And Elric thinks, doesn't he, that you can balance the two. You can balance the kind of the sword and the heart or something. Like, there is a phrase at one point where he tries to explain that, where he kind of talks about the importance of both. I think that first section is mostly setting that stuff up. And it also has one of the 6 chapters is just a very good action scene. Like there's
Yeah,
good fighting. Um, but that I'd say that's mostly what's going on there. I think is that it says here's Melniboné, this decadent, powerful but fading civilization. We'll probably come back to Melniboné as a concept, even if it's not an amazing geography. It is a really important concept, I think, in the book. It's fading, and it's kind of being attacked, and it's under threat, and Elric isn't maybe doing enough. I think that's the challenge he's been given. That's the kind of the plot of book one is he doing enough? Is he job?
yeah, and it was always interesting to me because I mean, he's described as weak, but he's weak physically. I mean, as an emperor, he seems strong enough. And I don't know why you were talking. That made me think of. I know we were discussing before we started recording about his angst against Tolkien, basically, and how there still seem to be a lot of similarities to Tolkien. I was thinking though that there was a couple things that came to mind that happen in part one that do seem to maybe be particularly, his against Tolkien thing. Because I'm pretty sure Cymril and Elric very early on don't they sleep together? And I mean,
Yeah.
Tolkien didn't have. I remember a critic said something about like he didn't have sex in his book, so therefore it wasn't like an adult book. And then also the fight scene was a lot more in depth, like and awesome to read. To be honest, I'm compared to Tolkien's fights, which are a lot more up in the air, kind of, and just kind of describing it to you maybe over a page. So,
No, certainly there's ways. Yeah, there's a good place to think about the fact because the Melniboné and the Melnibonéans are elves. Uh, they're described as elves basically. They're also a fading civilization of arrogant magic users in a mortal world, which kind of resents them in some ways. And this is one thing I think Moorcock's relationship with Tolkien is obviously really complex because Moorcock hates Tolkien in the way that Philip Pullman hates C.S. Lewis. There's an intentional definition against another author in both cases. Um, I wouldn't say. I mean, it's not a very good way. I think to create, but I think it's an important thing in their self-presentation. And I think there's something where sometimes you see he feels like he is leaning on Tolkien here, and then there's other parts where he is rebelling against Tolkien. And I think you're right in saying there's those things. But on the flip side, he is building a world that is obviously his answer to Middle Earth, and
yeah,
it means Middle Earth has got somewhere in his head, somewhere, hasn't it? Because he can't help but respond to it and try to argue with it, like he's arguing with his dad. Some,
yeah, yeah,
he inherits a lot. And yeah, so I think we then move on to book two, and we'll come back as I say we'll come back to some of these things, but book two, I guess, is the escalation, which leaves Elric is left for dead by his cousin at the end of this battle. So Yyrkoon, this traditionalist and who thinks that really what the younger nations need is a good kicking. It would be much better if Melniboné was out there taking over the world again. And we were debating whether or not we should really start a Yyrkoon was right campaign, because literally the first book contains the younger nations trying to destroy Melniboné. So in the end,
He was right on that
yeah,
count, at least.
Yyrkoon was right on that. So Yyrkoon manages, because Elric does not kill Yyrkoon when he might have public justification and he's merciful. Yyrkoon can take advantage of him. Um, and again, maybe we should come back to that later. Elric's character, we talked about that a bit. Then, so the second book is the Escalation, where we see Elric recovering from injury and then hunting down his cousin.
Yeah, it was initially. I mean, first off, I would say Yyrkoon is not subtle at all. Like there's no subtlety to his character, and yeah, because at the end of part one, he basically tries to kill Elric, and then Elric, at the start, he gets saved by the elemental, that King Strasha, and then when he gets taken back to Melniboné, Yyrkoon thinks he's about to become emperor, right? He's going to go into throne room, and I cannot speak, throne room, and crown himself, and Elric's sitting on the throne. He's just like, yo, what? So, like, he's super confused, of course. And then this is kind of when Elric is kind of like, okay, no more Mr. Nice Guy. Like, I can't deal with you acting like this anymore. They're cousins, right? I think. And so it's just like,
Cousins. So Yyrkoon and Chimaril or Cymaril are siblings,
oh, that's right, yeah.
and that's nothing like Moorcock is, and it's not clear whether this is meant to be something we see as decadent or whether it's something that's meant to be normalized. But there is like an incest theme going on at several levels in this book, which
Yeah.
I wonder whether it's something where in the only other books I read by Michael Moorcock, Dances at the End of Time, a major thing going on there is how liberation from taboo is good. And so I don't know what Moorcock is trying to communicate other than that. Elric and Cymaril are presented positively. Yyrkoon's desire for Cymaril is presented perversely. Like, so there is, but yeah. So we come back in,
Yeah.
and his cousin, yeah, as you say, he decides that it's time to deal with him and with like the other treacherous commanders of Yyrkoon's army, in the old Melnibonéan fashion, including, like, I think isn't the idea to like slowly cook the commander of the rebel forces and then feed him to Yyrkoon.
Yeah, it's something like that.
That's very traditional Melnibonéan pastime.
Nice and gruesome.
Yeah, that is, and there's, but then again, in the first book, there is a torture scene which we are meant to read as readers and think, wow, even though Elric has a conscience, he is very blasé to this kind of pretty brutal, weird torture scene.
He didn't care at all.
And we're meant to react like that, I think. So the Melnibonéans are not nice people.
Definitely not.
No. But then Yyrkoon escapes, and we get more. You kind of had this thing about elementals, like just these elementals all help or have to negotiate with Elric, and it's not really clear why.
Yeah.
They sort of just decide, like, Elric just bosses a bunch of people around, and then eventually he summons a demon.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's a big part of part two as well. Is that I think that's when he first summons Arioch, right? And it's also weird because King Strasha, the elemental, tells him, "Hey, yeah, you can trust me, but don't trust any of these." I think he calls them gods, right? I mean, he considers Arioch one of these gods or whatever. I don't really know. And the Melnibonéans worship these. Are they called demon lords or something? I can't remember. Lords of Chaos. That's what it is. Okay. So it's just like, it's really weird in my mind because it's like, why? I mean, is this Moorcock saying like trust natural stuff, gods aren't natural or something? Like, I don't really get it. I mean, it was a little weird to me. I mean, because it didn't make any sense. It's not explained. It's like, why are these guys bad? I mean, he's a demon. I mean, I get it. I mean, demons are bad, right? But why is elemental trust?
Arioch is bad. We almost don't have to, like, yeah, we accept that he's bad. It's something. This is part of the point I was making about pacing, though, is that just stuff happens. There's another chapter to write, and just something has to happen. In this one, he's a demon, and they're making a deal. Or he's kind of devil-like, and if you're your D&D cliche, it's more devil-like. There's a deal that they make. But this does fit in, and we don't know as much about this, obviously, but this does fit into this larger set of themes that Moorcock talks about over virtually all of his works, to do with law and chaos and the eternal hero, the idea of, constantly having to deal with the same problems, the reiteration of that theme. and Elric is the most famous of his eternal heroes. So I'm planning on reading Hawkmoon soon, which is Dorian Hawkmoon is another eternal hero in that kind of Moorcock canon. But I think that's one thing, is that just the pacing means just stuff keeps having to happen, and maybe if you're reading more, these themes stretch out more. But in the context of this book, they felt underdeveloped, perhaps.
Yeah. I would say that for
Yeah.
sure. I mean, it's always, I don't know how to say this. Like Ariok was, I mean, he did do a good job on making him kind of creepy. And
When he comes back in book three, and it's like he thought he saw like it's something horrendous, like some formless smoke slug. Oh, and then there's a handsome young man there.
yeah,
Just a good moment of like Ariok is not a good thing, but presents himself as good. In that sense, he's very classically demonic. He
right.
presents himself as an angel of light.
He's a Anatar or Sauron,
Yeah,
basically. Um,
yeah. Indeed. I mean, again, not that Moorcock will have read the Silmarillion,
true. Yeah.
the Calibet, but there's a similar thing where the imagery often is redolent of many sources, but including Tolkien, and certainly round, you'd say that round Ariok, he comes across like as you say, like maybe coincidentally, but like Anatar.
Yeah. And I think
In the same way you said that like Elric comes across like Turin at several levels,
it's so
and it can't be, you can't read it, but there's just this thing where you're like, you have the same, you're in the same groove. You think you're not, but you're running the same groove
I'm
at some level.
sure. I'm sure he disliked it. If he read the Silmarillion after it came out, he was like, "Yo, what the heck? Like, what is this?" And I was just like, because it's so. I mean, those coincidences with Turin, I think, are just so weird. He's got the dragon helm. He's got the black sword. He's like connected with Doom in like some odd way, like Turin and Elric. It's just like
There's even a slightly ambiguous relationship with a female relative.
it's so
Um,
so odd in my mind. I mean, but it makes sense. Yeah, it's right. There are these themes that, I mean, they're just. I mean, they happen, right? They're part of, in some ways, part of the human psyche. I mean, just but also
yeah,
left over.
and getting a bit Jungian here. But well, I guess there's something, is it the Volsung saga? You've got there are common cultural touchstones for some of those images, I guess. Which, I mean, are not Tolkien's. Tolkien doesn't own them, but it's weird when you think about how much. I think where the real post-Tolkien writers, and I'm talking about Stephen King, Dark Tower, Stephen Donaldson, Thomas Covenant,
Hmm.
Sword of Shannara, those big post Lord of the Rings trilogies that come out after the American Renaissance of Lord of the Rings, all those authors just accept those influences, whereas Moorcock really wants to fight a battle over them. Like there is, as I say, it's a rebellion at some level, or at least that's how it comes across to me. But it is something where they are sharing a lot of ground, and there's some fun stuff. I really like the ship that traverses both land and sea, or whatever it's
Yeah,
called.
that's from part two as well, I
That
think.
Yeah, that's from part two. Just because it's cool technology, the magical ship that elemental brothers Grome and Strasher made together, and then they fell out, and so it's Strasher's, but Grome really resents that.
Yeah,
But he has to
and it
Elric has to negotiate with Grome, and that's kind of a genuinely interesting bit of world building. This is one thing I think the world building and the concepts are often really interesting, even where they're not developed. But I like the fact that that's a tension he has to resolve. Is there's just this other elemental lord who has a really petty grievance against his random magical boat.
yeah, it's really silly, honestly, because Rome honestly comes off like he's I
Moron.
mean, like he's a troll or something. Like he's can't think like more than 2 sentences a minute or something. Like
Yeah,
it's
maybe that's intentional. I mean, classic depiction of Earth as an element, I guess. But
slow.
that's one. It, the things he makes up are constantly weird. It's something I find interesting in books. I find it interesting in the Mythico Wood cycle and in the Dark is Rising sequence, particularly Mythico Wood. I think Mythico Wood
Which I
is
want to
more
read.
interesting than this. Yeah, you should. I think you'd probably really like the Mythico Wood cycle. But yeah, the idea he comes up with constant new stuff all the time, and it's constantly fresh and interesting. And it reminds me of quite a lot of earlier pulp, good high pulp sci-fi and fantasy writers who are. Asimov is a good example for that. Of just constantly coming up with stuff, and it really was the Wild West. The sense that just you could sit down and write so many random new things that no one had really put into the genre before.
Yep,
Um,
not the
but
same
yeah,
today.
I like that. And then yeah, exactly. And then the third part. So he hunts down Yyrkoon. Yyrkoon has a magical mirror. That is so there's a magical item theme to go back to our Gygax thing, but like there's a magical mirror that you can't look at or something. That doesn't really matter. It essentially becomes a non-issue. He goes and deals with Yyrkoon. Then Yyrkoon has screwed him over to do with Chimeril, so he has to go through a magic mirror to like the land of. It's not the land of the dead. It's actually part of hell, I think, but just this other bad place. The bad place.
Yeah.
There's no sun. So everyone's
Yeah.
it hits every beat of like it's not a very nice place.
Yeah.
So he has to go if he's going to find Chimeril, find Yyrkoon and then rescue Chimeril. He has to do that. So that's the kind of the start to the third part. What were your kind of take on? What was your overview take on the third part?
Well, see, I forgot that he was even trying to rescue Chimeril. Like, I just
it didn't matter. It wasn't a thing that it mattered for the plot because technically that was the thing he wanted to go and sort out. Was he didn't care about Yyrkoon as much as about Chimeril. But maybe that kind of lets us touch, and we can return to it later, but touch on characterization that apart from Elric and a guy he meets in the bad place, Rakir, the characters they're not very deep.
No. Yeah, and that was the thing, and part of the reason I probably forgot is because Chimeril at the very end of the book, just like, yeah, no, I'm not going with you, Elric. So it's just like she doesn't play much of a character. I mean, as far as it really goes.
Yeah. So Elric at the end is like, I'm going to go off and do this thing, and then she's like, no, and you're like, that's quite sensible. Well done, Chimeril. Chimeril is a bit of a placeholder character, but then again, so's Yyrkoon. It is not that Chimeril is being fridged the whole time. It's not some terrible misuse of a female character. It is that most of his characters do the same thing of being placeholders for something that needs to happen to Elric.
Yeah, they're almost plot devices.
Desire to get in control, and that's only there to contrast with Elric.
Yeah.
And the same even with the other characters like Divim Tvar, who is the only other Melniboné with a conscience. It's kind of interesting, but doesn't do anything.
True.
You know, sad bit we talk about his son. There's the Admiral whose name I don't remember. That's the amount of detail I remember about him. And then there's Rakir in the third book, who is a human, which you're making the point that he feels different, and you thought it was because he was human, whereas these other people are basically elves. But yeah, Rakir really is a distinct character.
Yeah, I mean, he encourages Elric. You know, I mean, he helps Elric. Not, I mean, well, I think it's because Elric is like, yeah, I'll try to get you out of here, basically, right? But he's like still kind of like, you know, I think he saves Elric's life, doesn't he? I mean, at least once. And so it's just like, and
sorry, do you remember there's that old man who saves Elric's life and then disappears the next page? Do you remember that?
I don't remember that.
What? There's like a man in that. There's a man in the Bad Place City.
Was it?
The admiral's called Megum Colum, by the way. In the Bad City, there is another person in the Bad City who let's see.
Oh, is it that Niun who knew all character?
Yeah, who's only allowed to leave the bad place when he's forgotten everything.
That was such an interesting character. I wanted to bring him up actually.
That's kind of what I mean is that there's just stuff where Moorcock's like, here's an idea.
Yeah, that was like, I don't know. That seems like an idea you get like, you know, jogging or sitting on the toilet or something, and just like, yeah, this is pretty cool. And like he just puts it in there. It's like, you know, I can't really actually work with this for anything. He probably doesn't show up in any of the other books, to be completely honest, either. So it's just like,
I wonder how far he is a writer. I don't know anything about Michael Moorcock's writing process, so I don't want to like put this onto him. But how far is he a writer who just throws stuff, and a bit like Stephen King, you know, fire and forget. The wargaming term, fire and forget, just like here it is. Anyway, moving on. As you say, it's interchangeable. It's not unique to the story. A cool idea. Someone is under a magical curse that he'll only escape forgetting things. But he basically is a good character. It's a confusing thing. I think he is in hell because he's a good guy or something, if I remember rightly. But Rakir, this other guy, is a priest of Foom.
That's right. He came from like the Far East or something.
Who has forsaken his vows, I think, and he helps Elric, and he's loyal to Elric. He's finding a character, and he stays on stage with Elric for a long time, where even Divim Tvar or Chimeril don't really stay on stage very long. They kind of disappear the next minute. Um, there is a torturer who, sorry, I've suddenly connected something in my head. There is a kind of weird, nasty torturer in Lies of Locke in a scene that made me
Really?
frankly quite uncomfortable. But and the torture in this is you're like, maybe there's some kind of connection there. But yeah, there's that grim torturer. There's Yyrkoon. There's Megan Colin. Most of them don't do anything for very long. They're not on stage for very long. Whereas Rakir gets time to expand as a character and is comfortably the best secondary character in the book. Even though he
Easily.
doesn't do much, even though it's not like you have loads of his inner torment. Other than that, he's a bit sad that he forsook his vows. An interesting character, and he tries to even go with Elric into a battle like that will surely be fatal for him, and Elric has to kind of tell him not he can't come.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a good character. I liked him, and he doesn't do that because Elric's going to save him. He builds a relationship with Elric. And then finally, basically the book ends in book 3, in the conclusion, the culmination. The real ending is Elric finds Yyrkoon at the place where the magical blades that have like a connection to Melniboné are hidden or have been summoned or something, and they get to have a magical sword fight, like in and kind of a fantasy anime.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it. It was I don't know, something always felt like off about that ending. It was just like, I don't know, it was just like weird. It kind of seemed a little pointless. I mean, I know Yyrkoon wanted the swords for like power, and I realized Stormbringer is important for Auric's character. I mean, I don't know, just the whole like leading up to it was just like, I don't know. I mean, before that, Yyrkoon was had a magic mirror, in this city, and it's just like all of a sudden, yeah, I'm going through this portal, but I gotta get the sword. It's just like, what the heck? Why didn't he do that before? I don't get it.
Like underground, it's a set of caves that are like human organs.
Yeah, which is also a little off.
Now we're two pale freaks, with like weird, like, well, one of them is the kind of Melnibonéan freak, and the other guy is the archetypal kind of evil person, but he's kind of morally decrepit and degenerate. Because that's a comparison, isn't it? Like Elric is physically weak and broken, and is seen as that. Is seen as a freak. Yyrkoon is morally broken. But yeah, then there's these two pale elves fighting with magical swords in like a bowl or something. Which I don't know. I think my main issue there was again just that it felt maybe a little bit hurried. Like we'd appeared here, like, oh yep, we just need to get to the ending. Time to get to the ending. I'm bored now.
Yeah.
Magical swords. That is more or less it. What happens is they fight. There's a decent fight scene. Moorcock is actually pretty decent at action, I think. Then I forget how Elric goes home. He goes home, says, "I'm going to go around adventuring because that sounds cool," pretty much, and that's the end of the story.
Yep, that's basically it. I mean, he's gonna get the sword because at least on my cover he has the sword. And I mean,
also, Moorcock. This is actually something interesting about when an author does this. Moorcock writes the book headings, at least in mine. I assume he does in yours. He sums up what's going to happen in the book headings. So, book 1 is about various things that are going to happen. Book 2 and book 3 have a similar thing where it kind of gives a summary of the book and tells you some of the things that are going to happen. It's not meant to be a surprise that, in fact, it starts by saying, and the stuff happens that's going to eventually lead to the destruction of the world. I think Moorcock is then, again, if you want to talk about something Tolkienian, the idea that Tolkien was very interested in the idea of basically fata, and the idea that history is not cyclical in a sort of Eastern religion sense, but maybe there's some degree of arc. You see that with some of his talk, Gandalf talking about providence, the idea that providential force, Erioluvatar, has caused things to happen in a particular way, is only working out now. And I think you can see that Moorcock is interested in the same idea that these stories have somehow inevitable endings. They have different views on that, but I'm just saying, like, you can see there's another thematic similarity that some authors, like again Stephen King, Dark Tower does something similar, but you don't read. I'm trying to think of a good example. Even Brandon Sanderson, who you might think might have that kind of idea, has none of that. That is not where Sanderson is. Lieber does not have the idea that there are great fated stories. Fafnir and the Grey Mouser mostly just accidentally have things happen to them. So this is very much in the kind of epic, doomed Norse saga.
yeah.
in that sense, the fact that it all happens is inevitable, and we know it is, so it's not surprising. It's not in that sense. You could say it is not a spoiler to start a review by saying Elric is an emperor who ends up kind of losing his empire, more or less, so he can find a weird magic sword. That's a
Yeah,
because Moorcock tells you that's what's going to happen.
yeah, and I mean,
And
he gives up his empire, but I mean, you also, I mean, Moorcock does explicitly say that Melniboné is doomed. Like he says it in the book. So
and, and you have there's that whole bit, there's loads of depression going on with Chimeril at one point. He obviously has some kind of precognition that things are going to go wrong. It doesn't even happen in the book. Like presumably it's going to happen in future books, but yeah. Another theme, yeah, Melniboné and Elric, I thought was interesting as not as a geography. Melniboné was not very interesting as a geography, but as picture of decadence. And I think in my edition, Alan Moore writes a foreword or an introduction, which basically has more identifying Melniboné with post World War II, post Imperial Britain, a fading island nation with formerly with an empire, powerful, rich, beautiful, wonderful in lots of ways, but cruel. As in that's Moore's view. That's presumably Moorcock's view, because that's a pretty common view. And I thought that was really interesting as way in which Melniboné is presented ambiguously. Melniboné is not this utterly horrendous place that you hate. It is a place where people love each other and build beautiful things and are good at stuff, but at the same time, which just has a deep vein of pathological cruelty. And I just thought there's an interesting concept. Why would someone write about that? I'm not saying he shouldn't have. I like it, but I'm like, why would what leads you to say that's where I want my setting to be?
yeah,
Make it very intentional like that, and make the moral question of the book be: can you reconcile morality with power or with effectiveness? Because in fact, that's the problem: is that Elric is ineffective because of his conscience.
yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because I mean, the Melnibonéans have to have a conscience, right? I mean, it would be different. Like, oh man, I'm not doing good if I didn't, torture someone today or something. And it's just like, I mean, they even was the name the capital. I don't remember its actual name. He even mentions it, but it's called the Dreaming City, if I'm remembering correctly. And it's because they all have like this sense of, I don't know, nostalgia. Maybe is a good word for it.
Yeah, I only this only mentioned at the very start, but they all have like intense. They have like dream technology, don't they? Where they can
Yeah,
just go and have dreams. Yeah. So no, that's something which that's interesting, isn't it? That it is at some level about nostalgia. I tagged Liam with a nostalgia tag. He might have recorded it by now. I don't know. By the time you see this, but yeah, the idea that what nostalgia is the original meaning of nostalgia is it's longing for home. It's a kind of echo of something not just from the past, but of something deeper and more primal. I think that's something going on there that they've lost something, and that's why people want Yyrkoon to be a traditional Melnibonéan who'll take over the world and kill their enemies. But Elric is maybe trying to move them beyond that, maybe trying to move them to. I don't think he ever really resolves the question of whether it is better to have a human conscience where you think it's bad to be horrible to people, or whether you should have a Melnibonéan conscience where you should do that which is glorious and good and powerful and good for Melniboné.
yeah,
And there is a debate that is never resolved.
yeah,
Even Elric doesn't know how to resolve it. That's part of his tension inside, is that he doesn't know how to resolve whether to be cruel or kind.
yeah. He's kind of a. He seems like he's afflicted, not just with that, but with the more modern reality as opposed to traditional values of. So, and then let's see. So that's basically the book, right? That's parts 1, 2, and 3. I mean, at the end of the book, he's like, "Let's go on an adventure," basically, and so like the book basically just set up his character. That's really all it did. And I mean, the next book, I mean, just to mention it real quick, is well, I guess at the time this one was written, the next book shortly after that was Sailors on the Seas of Fate, right? I mean, I think later there's a book that actually I know later this one came out, and that takes place closer to right after Elric. But
Yeah, I don't know which order I'll read them in. I think because I'm interested in the Gygax stuff, I'll read Tales on the Sea of Fate next, probably.
yeah, and so but it was like the whole book seemed like an introduction to the character,
Mm.
and
Yeah,
that's not bad. I don't think that was a bad thing. I mean, it was interesting because I think it kind of, um, I mean, it kind of how we mentioned before, the characters don't have a lot of depth, and I think it's because of that. I mean, they're just there to move the plot along. So Elric can basically leave Melniboné and have the Stormbringer and what he does. I mean, that's essentially all that Moorcock wanted to happen.
Yeah, and I think the comparison is it's a 160-page book or whatever. But if you compare it, and Sanson wrote it, it would be more like it would be less Mistborn and more Stormlight Archive. It'd be more 1,200 pages than 500 pages, which is crazy. But it is something where the story, what happens in it, is epic in scope enough that if you wanted to fill in the gaps and have more stuff on his journey, and have more long point of view reflections on things, you could fill up 500, 600, 1,000 pages with it. But for good or bad, partly for good, partly for bad, Moorcock just wants it done in 160. And so in that sense, yeah, it is very much the start to a story rather than a whole story. But it is also a whole story. And yeah, I guess as I've come back to this a few times, that's a tension for me. I don't know whether I really like that or not. But yeah, that's the book. That's Tolkien. We've talked about the Tolkien stuff quite well, I think. We talked about the character stuff, world building, and the morality. The fact that there's these different moral tensions. I'm trying to think, well, was there anything else? Yeah, it's an influence on D&D. Not so much this book, but certainly Stormbringer, and Mournblade are definitely a direct official influence on earliest D&D in terms of certain magical swords. And there are a few
Yeah,
things there. Maybe the thing is, as a tortured anti-hero, you were saying, and I think I agree. Elric in this book is not really an anti-hero. I mean, yes, he oversees torture, but that does not make him an anti-hero. The whole thing is he goes around being like, should we really torture people? Whatever. Or is that the best way to do stuff? Basically, just a hero, but with a weird situation. I feel like he has essentially heroic aims. He essentially follows the hero's journey within the
yeah,
book from being young and untested and going through failure, finding new success, traveling on a journey. Classic, lots of heroes' journey stuff, and it's all to rescue his love and to protect his empire. It's all pretty normal hero stuff. What's maybe anti-heroic about him in modern terms is just how angsty he is, just how much it's a kind of internal reflection on how bad everything is.
yeah. And I guess in reality that makes me think that I mean, I haven't read a ton of works from around that time, but I can't think of any other art like main character that's so angsty. I mean, like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse are definitely aren't. None of Tolkien's characters are for
Well, I was going to say, I mean, except of all people, the one person who also has to carry a difficult magical item, Frodo Baggins.
sure.
That's a different kind of thing in that. But of course, it's Frodo falls to the ring, so
Yeah,
maybe a parallel there again. But no, certainly it's not common. Conan does not reflect very much on his actions, does he? Nor does John Carter of Mars. Nor does Harry Seldon. If we're going to go to sci-fi, Harry Seldon isn't there being like, man, should I come up with this mathematical system to predict the future? Could this not strip humans of their freedom? Harry Seldon's just like, yeah, this is great, let's do it. It's
right.
lots of those characters, even where they are interesting characters like Lee Brackett's Han Solo anti-heroes, because she does write anti-heroes. They're not really tortured in the same way. There's sometimes poignancy and complexity, but they're not. They don't constantly sit inside themselves reflecting on whether or not they've done evil stuff or whether the world is worth saving. They just do stuff, and I think you can tell with Elric, he is the original sad boy. I think.
That's a good way of putting it. I think he would actually, sort of because of that, and honestly, just because of how easy Moorcock's prose is to read. I feel like this is pretty widely accepted among modern art audiences. I mean, it isn't a grand epic like on a Brandon Sanderson scale, but I mean, if you could just convince someone that like, hey, a short book's fine. I mean, because
Yeah.
I mean, most people don't read even anything close to Sword and Sorcery these days. I mean,
Yeah,
I
I
think
know.
it would be
I
widely
think
accepted.
so, yeah. I think it's a good point, by the way, that sword and sorcery, and I think this would be argued. People would say this is a sword and sorcery book in lots of ways. A lot of that classic sword and sorcery stuff is short enough that booktubers and book readers, bookish people, but also normies should enjoy it. I think in the set. By that I mean, if you don't like it, it's over quickly.
Right.
I think that's something which is an underrated quality, especially given people are like, oh, I've got all these big books to read. These are good palate cleansers. They are quicker, and Moorcock is a good writer. He has easy prose.
Yeah.
I think there are imperfections in his style, but his prose is easy. And again, that's not what you always get from fantasy writers. I wouldn't say it's beautiful, but it is effective. And yeah,
Yeah.
you'd probably say the same about Fafnir the Grey Mouser, the same about Edgar Rice Burroughs' stories, the same about Conan. They're all pretty quick and easy to read.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because I mean like um even by like I mean a short book nowadays is probably about 300, right? I mean that's what we'll probably say for short book. And these are shorter than that. I mean this book is half that. So it's
Yeah.
just like
You're right. Well, the Hugo length for novels is 40,000 words, but 40,000 words now is very short. I think
that's very
standard.
small. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Harry
Um,
Potter books are longer than that.
yeah, well, I read a lot of Lois McMaster Bujold, and though some of her fantasy novels are that length, basically most of her sci-fi novels, here's an omnibus. That's an omnibus of two novels and a novella, are much shorter. So once they're into mass market paperback, they're like 200 pages or less. And I think that's an outdated. I'm not saying it's actually outdated, but in terms of sales, it's an outdated model. People don't buy short books. Maybe I don't know if that's
Yeah,
true, but
I mean, I used to only read a couple of years ago. I mean, just a couple of years ago, I only used to read those big, hefty, high epic fantasy books, and I've broadened my horizon. And so,
yeah, no. Sometimes small is beautiful. That said, and I mean, I think this is probably closing out the points I remember from what we're thinking about. But there are probably ways in which Elric is outdated. Outdated, by the way, I don't think means tut. I disagree with this or that. Even what I mean is there are things that, particularly because sometimes the things that are outdated are things that author thought were modern and up to date and awesome and cool, but rather there are things that haven't aged well. That's what I mean. And I think the very, very arch over the tops knowing style probably hasn't aged very well. I think it's something which probably seemed very edgy in the 1960s and early 70s, and now kind of just comes across as a bit like, okay, yeah, okay, we know you're very clever. Yeah, if we could, it's something you never catch Tolkien doing. It's for someone else who has a really, really heavy style. That's very much an authorial voice. Tolkien never gives you the impression he's congratulating himself. Whereas
right.
I definitely felt like Moorcock really thought his writing was the best.
Which
Um,
is interesting because I mean, Tolkien put a lot of effort in his writing. I mean, I mean, he made it the best he could, right? I mean, but yeah, he definitely doesn't give you that vibe that he thought it was the best because so clever and stuff.
yeah, yeah, that hasn't aged well. And I think the other thing that I'd say probably hasn't aged as well is the character work. Like, don't
Yeah,
get many popular modern like genre novels, sci-fi fantasy novels, where the secondary characters are all literally completely irrelevant. you know,
right. Yeah,
uh,
that's a great point.
not common. The stuff that has aged well is just the action, the world building, in terms of the concepts he puts out there, and the imagery. I think that stuff is all time great, probably in terms of like top 10% of all things. What your fight? Yeah, what were the things that you took away as most as like this has contributed to fantasy and this sticks with you?
See, I couldn't help but see the relation to Dungeons and Dragons, but we already talked about that. And Dungeons and Dragons is a big
I
influence.
will do a video about that eventually, probably. Yeah.
And so, but I mean, besides that,
Of course, because there's a multiple level, so like D&D influences modern fantasy,
yeah,
and not just epic saga fantasy, but all modern fantasy is basically sub D&D. It's post D&D, and so in that sense, it is a kind of a thing where there are influences being filtered through. So Sanderson is a good example. Magical swords, pretty big on the old magical swords is Brandon Sando. And so I think, yeah, you can see these influences going through where Moorcock is on with Tolkien and the big sort of influences of a certain style, creators of a certain style that influences D&D and therefore influences modern fantasy. But yeah, so yeah, no, you're right. I agree. But yeah, sorry, what else?
along those same lines, even I haven't finished the series, but as far as I'm aware, even like Gygax's own Gord the Rogue series later becomes very much an Elric thing, like Eternal Champion fighting against
Yeah.
demons, chaos, and so. But besides that, yeah, just the edgy hero is more of, I mean, maybe not edgy, but a hero that is thoughtful but also not necessarily good is very much a modern trend, I feel like, or popular in modern fantasy works. And I mean, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser aren't good guys either, but they're not. They don't put a lot of thought into their acts
Yeah.
or anything. So
In fact, particularly, maybe the point is that they are good guys. The ultimate point is that they are good guys, and the kind of the degree to which they're bad is passing. So yeah, I think it's interesting because you see a cycle there, don't you? That there are some other post-Tolkien heroes who are troubled. Roland Deschain from the Dark Tower, Thomas Covenant from the Thomas Covenant Chronicles, which I've mentioned both of those today. But those are not what becomes dominant, because even Rand in Wheel of Time, but let alone some of the kind of sort of Shannara characters or other kind of 70s 80s characters, and McCaffrey, I find the Pern novels really interesting. Those characters, even when they have troubles, they are basically straight down the line, aren't they? They are like, they save the world.
yeah,
Whereas Elric just wanders around a torture room being like, is this okay? It's probably okay.
yeah,
So yeah, that will link forward to your first lore and to your Lies of Loch Lamora and to your kind of troubled on the borderline or even evil in terms of first lore or Malazan heroes. But I guess that is where maybe he is a proto anti-hero. He's not an anti-hero. He leads to later anti-heroes.
yeah. And it makes me think, at least of something you said, is that like the story is is entirely focused on Elric as a character, and
Mm.
I mean the other characters just move the plot along, kind of discussed. And I mean, I haven't read it, so maybe you have a better idea. But I heard like First Law, for example, doesn't have much plot. It just has more in character work, and so maybe that. I mean, I don't know if Abercrombie's read anything by Moorcock or anything.
Yes, some of these things are just in the atmosphere, though. I think once an author establishes a style, it will go via all kinds of channels of influence to influence later writers. You never live that far away from 6 degrees of separation style. You never live that far away from another writer in the same tradition.
Very true.
Yeah, you can probably look at lots of those plotless, character intense stories as probably being in part post Moorcock.
Yeah, even something as popular as the Song of Ice and Fire has obvious influence from Elric. So
Yeah. Oh no, yeah. It's certainly that kind of well, and perhaps for him it's via Tad Williams. Perhaps for Martin it's via Tad Williams. But the idea of
yeah, maybe.
yeah, yeah. Well, but that's the thing. It's multiple. You get multiple influences. This is part of actually why I think it's so silly, basically, to spend your time defining yourself against authors who plainly have created you. As I say with Moorcock and Tolkien, spending your time saying about how Tolkien is a worse writer than you just reminds us how much you write like Tolkien.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
What a guy.
Indeed. I mean, yeah. We all have our baggage, though, so, bless him.
Yeah. Yeah. I forgot about I don't know how I forgot in Memory Sauron Thorin Swords. Since the series is called Memory Sauron Thorin. Whatever.
Yeah, indeed. Which are named a tiny bit redolent, aren't they, of Mournblade and Stormbringer.
Yeah.
And as you say, going to the Valyrian swords, I guess the Valyrian swords aren't like supernatural, but they are. They kind of are. They're kind of obviously meant to be a bit like, ooh,
Yeah,
maybe
and
there's
it's
something.
even the Valyrians themselves. Was it Valyrian Freehold? I haven't read all of A Song of the Ice and Fire that's out. I've only read the first three, but I mean, they're pale haired, kind of like. I mean, Elric is an albino, I know, but he's pale haired,
Yeah,
and they have weak blood,
yeah.
and like he does
Pale haired, slightly anemic, or are they
dragons.
anemic or hemophiliac? But one or the other, yeah. Like they ride dragons. That's one thing. Elric rides dragons. The dragons are really irrelevant in the book as well. It's
Yeah,
not the case where he's just. By the way, these elves they ride dragons. Um,
yeah, and it's
are
so
you going to? Are the elves going to ride the dragons? No, no, no.
no,
Not
yeah,
the elves ride the
they're
dragons.
just asleep most of the time.
Yeah, and they were used off screen last page. Sorry, guy. it's like, it's like an author who doesn't actually want you to hear about any of his ideas or see anything happen in the world.
Right.
Like all a gigantic practical joke. But yeah, exactly. The Valyrians are pale-haired, weak-blooded elves from a fallen imperial realm. At least the ones who go to Westeros are who ride dragons. Exactly, exactly. And they go around burning and destroying everything in a very ruthless way, like the Melnibonéans.
Yeah,
So yeah, no, via yeah, as you say, via many different kind of channels, perhaps you get to that. Cool.
yeah. So I don't looking through my notes. I mentioned the things I had thought of beforehand. So I mean, unless you had anything else to add.
Oh,
Um,
I think that's pretty much it. I think the summary would be I enjoyed it, and the flaws were over such a short book that it didn't bother me. So I think people should read it if they are interested in like a I think a fairly important entry in the history of fantasy that still holds up to reading.
yeah, and I definitely agree with that. I definitely would suggest it, and I did enjoy it. I did enjoy it, and I'm hoping to get to another Elric book soon-ish. I don't know how define soon, right? And so, but yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed being able to discuss this with you. The first
I
discussion
did
video
too.
I've ever done. I did Thieves World for September. I don't know if I'll be doing a discussion video for that, but I would just again. So thanks, Owen, for joining, and
Inviting me.
yeah, and maybe we'll do this again after October. So we'll be buddy reading Shadow
Yes.
Law.
We will be reading the first one or two books in Book of the New Sun, depending on how you define that.
Right.
Like Elric, that has like four different definitions of how the books are grouped. I think so.
Yeah.
Reading the first two books in the Book of the New Sun series. I'll probably put up a buddy read announcement on my channel soon. I'm sure you would the same. But yeah, I'd love to do that then. Definitely.
Yeah, well, definitely. I'm very interested to see it. I have not read Teen Wolf, so my brother loves
I've
him
read
though.
one book by him. I own another couple, but I own one book. But I've read one book by him, which I really enjoyed. The Fifth Head of Cerberus. Very strange book, but very good.
Yeah, I haven't even heard of that one. But anyways, I do hear good things and strange things about Wolf. So, and he actually lived near where I grew up. I
Oh,
believe he passed away a few years ago. If I'm not mistaken.
uh,
Um,
noughties. I think not that long ago, comparatively.
yeah. So, anyways, that will be a wrap on the video. Hopefully, I'll have this up next week. I'm not really sure. So, but again, thanks for joining, Owen, and this has been Liam and and with Liam's Lyceum this time. So, and until next time.